Dear friends, last week I talked about the priority of grace, that there is nothing that we can do to make God love us any more, and nothing that we can do to make God love us any less. There is an immense spiritual freedom that comes from realizing this, and also a great spiritual temptation, which is what Paul is talking about in our passage this morning. Grace is a wonderful and amazing thing. And Paul asks, shall we simply continue sinning so that grace can multiply forever? This is clearly an argument that has been made against the gospel, and Paul is here arguing against it. And his case is essentially why and how we can continue to be guided by rules even when we rest in grace. Now, to sum up what that temptation is, I want to share a word with you, the word antinomianism. That's a mouthful. Now, this is a Christian heresy, and it's the target that Paul has in mind. The word means a rejection of rules. It's from the Greek word nomos, which means the law, or rules, or ethics, and the word anti, well, you know that means against. If you think of our English word libertine, that's the sort of person who I think Paul has in mind as an opponent. Now, I'm going to be very careful here because this isn't Paul. He gets a bit bogged down in words himself, and I'm trying to not get too bogged down in words. But this sense of antinomianism is against rules rather than the law, and in particular the works of the law, which has a very specific and very Jewish meaning, which Paul gets onto in a few weeks' time. But now I'm falling into the same word bog trap which St. Paul sometimes gets into. So let's move on swiftly. Antinomianism. It's a really tricky heresy to deal with because it's something that comes so close to the truth. There is a real and genuine liberty that comes from believing the gospel, from allowing it to sink into our hearts and transform our behaviour. Yet the gospel does not abolish the law. After all, as Jesus said, he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Rather, the gospel places the law, all rules, all ethics, into their proper context and teaches us how to engage with them. What changes when we receive the gospel is our motivation. The new covenant, as prophesied by Jeremiah, have a look at chapter 31. It's about the law, the rules, being written in our hearts because we know God. Instead of being motivated by a fear of punishment, which is rooted in a lack of trust in what Jesus taught us about the love of God, instead we are to be motivated by love because we know that God is love. We love because God first loved us. Whilst we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Remember that? And Jesus sums this up. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, St. Augustine once wrote, and this is a bit of a paraphrase, love God and do what you want. The problem of antinomianism is that it only emphasises the latter part of that equation, the do what you want bit. Christians, in contrast, hear what Jesus says in John's Gospel. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. In other words, we keep the rules, but the spirit in which we keep them has changed. We're motivated by love. So, to return to Paul's language, to accept the freedom of the gospel is not to become antinomian, a libertine, freely doing whatever we will in order that the grace might abound. Rather, accepting the gospel is about changing our hearts, so that we are motivated by love and not fear. We love God, and we let that love guide us. And so we die to sin and all the ways in which we are captured by sin, and we live freely in Christ. Now, what that leads to is another word, sanctification. But I'll explain that next week. Until we meet again. Amen.